Hello everyone, and welcome for this second talk of our series on open source tools for neurosciences. So these talks are part of the Open Neuroscience Initiative, which is basically a central repository for open source projects related to neurosciences. If you have a project and if you would like to list it there, or if you would like to contribute, you can directly contact us on the website, which is open-neuroscience.com, or on Twitter. We are also part of the Worldwide Neuro Initiative, a COVID-inspired platform where fellow neuroscientists daily host similar talks, but in their respective fields. So you will find all the relevant links in the description. Today, we are very glad to receive Ankur Sinha. So Ankur obtained his bachelor in engineering from Manipal Institute of Technology in India, then a master in engineering from the University of Technology in Sydney, and finally, he recently received his PhD in computational neuroscience from the University of Hertfordshire, where he was part of the biocomputation group under Volker Sturber supervision. He started last year a postdoctoral fellowship at University College London at the Silver Lab. Ankur is also a member of the Organization for Computational Neuroscience and a member of the International Neuroinformatics Coordinating Facility, whose main mission is to develop, evaluate, and endorse standards and best practices that embrace the principle of open, fair, and citable neuroscience. As a FOSS enthusiast, so understand free, libre, and open source software, Ankur is trying to spread the message of FOSS and evidence-based science. He has therefore joined the Fedora Community project, which NeuroFedora is a part of. So NeuroFedora is an initiative to provide a ready-to-use Fedora Linux-based free open source software platform for neurosciences. And this is what Ankur is going to describe to us today. So, hello Ankur, thanks for being with us today. How are you doing?
Hello, thank you very, very much. That introduction was great to the extent where it reminded me that I have actually been in academia for a decade now, which is very less compared to a lot of people I know, but yeah, but it's still a long journey. Thanks very much. I hope everybody is doing well nowadays and hanging on, well, for a bit more, I would say. I guess I'll share my screen and we should get started.
Let's go for it.
Right. Great. Yes, as Maxine already explained, I come from a computing background, so my bachelor's was in computing. My master's was computational in the sense that I worked on robotics, but it was neuroscience-inspired robotics. And throughout all of this time, I have remained in contact with the free and open source software community. During this time, as you work with more and more software, and you become aware of things like open science, you realize that software is really, really critical when it comes to the sciences. And with that in mind, a few of us got together and started working on NeuroFedora. So let's have a look. I always like to start with a brief, let's say a philosophical note. Open science is luckily no longer new. It's well established. Everybody that comes through academia will hear of it, will be aware of it. Most universities and groups will have trainings that are necessary for people to go through, so they're aware of their responsibilities when it comes to open science. And the summary of open science is that everyone should have the freedom to study, modify, and share scientific material. And scientific material is not limited to papers and publications. It's data, it's the code you use to analyze your data, the methods, the algorithms, all of this should be available to everybody. And when we work in the scientific environment, sometimes we get bogged down into details so much that the definition of everyone sort of narrows down to everybody in science. But that's not actually what the ideal is, right? The ideal is that all of this material should be available to everyone, whether or not they are in academia, whether or not they are in developed countries, whether or not they are at academic institutions. And it's not the most trivial ideal. It is not easy to manage. There are pragmatic issues that make it really hard to achieve this. But we are making progress slowly but surely. Some of you will be aware of the open letter that you can see at opensourceforneuroscience.org that Boris Gleason and a bunch of other senior computational scientists wrote, saying that they promised that all their work, all their code, all the technology they use will be open source and will be available for everybody to access. In parallel with open science, you have the free and open source software movement. Now, open science, the term was coined, I think, towards the end of the 90s. The free software movement started in the mid-80s at MIT. And it started because as more and more software companies started to make profits, they started to close down the source code, because if everybody has a source code, then it's hard to monetize. But the free and open source software community has been around since the mid-80s. And as you see here, the goal for the FOSS ecosystem is very similar to the goal for the open science ecosystem. There's a slight difference between what the free software movement wants to say and what the open source software movement wants to say. But in both of them, the point is that everybody should be able to study, modify, and share the software they use. The user must have this freedom. And of course, it's easy to see how open science and FOSS go hand in hand. And in fact, open science nowadays is heavily dependent on FOSS software, right? Not just for the Python tools or the libraries we use for analysis, but the infrastructure that is used now, the supercomputing infrastructure, for example. Some of you may use MPI as a message passing interface to run parallelized code. All of this is heavily reliant on free and open source software. And the ecosystem of the free and open source software community is heavily based on Linux distributions. So the operating systems, and we call them distributions because they essentially are the same core. They all run on the same software code. What differs is how they are deployed, how they are developed, what the community values are. And I've shown some of the really relatively well-known ones. So most people have heard of Debian or Ubuntu or SUSE or Fedora. Mint and Arch Linux are two other very well-known ones, which most people would use. But the truth is that, and this is a feature of being able to modify, share, and study code, that there are thousands of these distributions, each subtly different, right? Somebody went and used Debian and they said, well, I think I would like to do this in my way. And because all of this information is available, they can tweak it and come up with their own distribution. As the name suggests, the Fedora distribution is, the NeuroFedora distribution is based on the Fedora Linux community project. This is just another FOSS organization that is backed by Red Hat. Red Hat is a software company that provides enterprise solutions. It got acquired by IBM for $34 billion with a B in 2019. So it has a huge market. Most servers in enterprise and the idea is that the Fedora community will promote FOSS. And they do this by creating a Linux operating system, right? And now it's not just enough to have an operating system. That doesn't make it easy to use. You also have to provide lots of client tools to users of this operating system so that they can easily get started and get down to work. What you see on the left are the 4 foundations for this community. This is another hallmark of the open source ecosystem. Communities they're not just about getting work done, they're also about having fun. And so you see friends as a foundation, right? So you have social gatherings, people from different time zones will have different gatherings, they all come together. You'll have release parties, you have conferences, you have unconferences. And all of this, the whole idea is that you work as a community. There isn't so much a hierarchy. Everybody is pretty much a colleague and a friend, and you all work together towards a common goal. Officially, to summarize, what the Fedora Linux project does is that we make an operating system and we make it easy for people to do useful stuff with it, right? And some people here may be aware of NeuroDebian. NeuroDebian is the same thing. The only difference is that where Fedora is based on the RPM ecosystem, where it's linked to Red Hat, CentOS, and Scientific Linux, for example, NeuroDebian is based on the Debian distribution. The one advantage of having something linked to the RPM ecosystem is that most supercomputers nowadays use CentOS or Scientific Linux. And by developing this platform for Fedora, it makes it easy for us to transfer all of this work onto CentOS and Scientific Linux, right? So in FOSS jargon, one would say that Fedora is upstream to CentOS and Scientific Linux. Whatever work happens in Fedora ultimately ends up in Red Hat, CentOS, and Scientific Linux. Right? So even though at the moment we are developing things for Fedora, in the future, when we do have enough users and they want to use the same tools on clusters and other infrastructure, it will be easy for us to port all of this over and make it available there. Right. To give you a quick summary of the Fedora community, it is not an academic community, right? It is an open source software community. And as you can see from this rather colorful picture, it is diverse. A lot goes into developing an operating system. And there are people in the community that work on security. There are people that work on lower-level operating system infrastructure. There are people that work on different platforms. So most of us would use 64-bit systems now, supported by Intel. But there are other specialized platforms like the PowerPC and Spark. Of course, ARM is gaining ground. That's what runs in most of our phones now. There are people that make sure Fedora can run on all of these platforms. A lot of people are into programming. So if you look at the light green bits here, we have special interest groups of different programming languages. Some of the people here actually contribute to the development of these languages. So we have a Python special interest group, and a lot of people in the Fedora special interest group help maintain Python upstream. And in all of this, right, so we have diversity, you have design for people who are non-technical. In all of this, NeuroFedora is a small oval right at the end. Right? And we are one of the few science-related special interest groups where we're joined by the astronomy SIG, the big data SIG, there's a machine learning SIG now. So we are part of this large community. And the advantage is that there's common infrastructure, there are common processes, and the work we put in will benefit everybody in the community, right? So if somebody from the infrastructure team does something new, it propagates to the whole community. Everybody gets to take advantage of what somebody has done, right? So in this way, what we do is we leverage the resources that are common to the community, that are maintained by the community, to develop an artifact for a specific domain, right? And the domain is neuroscience. So as another example of the community-based way we work, this logo, for example, is designed by somebody from the design team, right? When we started out, we said it'll be nice for us to have a logo so that we can market ourselves easily. You file a ticket with them. There are a few rounds of reviews where we make sure that it's visible, it's it's clear, it's unique, and in a few weeks we have this fantastic logo that we now use everywhere on all our web space. And the way we make this, the way we want to make it easy to do neuroscience in the Fedora ecosystem is by making neuroscience tools easily available on Fedora Linux platforms, right? So the general workflow for this would be that you download a Fedora Linux operating system. There are about 20 variants, depending on what domain you want to look at. But if you go to the main website, getfedora.org, you'll get to see the main 3 editions that the community promotes. One of them, if you can see here, is a workstation, which is designed for laptops and home computers. So you go there, you download this, you get an ISO image, which, like a Windows or a Mac image, you can either install on hardware. What makes Linux distributions different is that our images are also live, and I'll show this later, where you can use them without actually installing them on your systems. And as part of this ecosystem, we have a default package manager called DNF. And the advantage of using a Fedora platform is that you have access to thousands of tools that can be installed using a single command via DNF, right? So where on your own system, you might install something, but you might then go up to GitHub, download the source code, have to build it. We do all of that for you. All you have to do is run any Fedora platform, and you have access to all of this, right? What we've managed to do already, and this is primarily because my background is computational neuroscience, is we've already managed to develop an operating system for Comp Neuro, So it's a Fedora platform, but along with all the normal bits that Fedora will have for general purpose use, we've also pre-installed lots of computational neuroscience software in it, right? You can go to labs.fedoraproject.org and you will be able to download this there directly. It's about a 2 gigabyte download. And as I'll show you in a minute, it's ready to use right from the off. Here is a list of tools that we include there now. All of them are related to computing, to computational science rather, along with various simulators. So for example, we've got Nest, we've got Neuron, we've got the LEMS ecosystem here, we've got NeuroML. If you're into model validation, you've got SciUnit. We also include the complete Python science stack. So that's SciPy, NumPy, Matplotlib, IPython, Pandas, SymPy. We've also got stats models and so on. For people that like pretty graphs, we've got GNUplot. For people that are on MATLAB, we have GNU Octave, which is a free and open source replacement for MATLAB, which I strongly suggest you should try out. Of course, we've got Brian, which is now quite popular. But the idea is that once we've converted it into a Fedora package, it can easily be provided as part of this operating system, right? I'm going to give you a quick demo now. So I've already downloaded the installer image. You can see 3 of them there. These are 3 variants of the artifacts that Fedora produces. I'm going to show you the comp neuro image, which I will run in my virtual machine. Right, I'm going to give it a little more memory so it doesn't quite lag. And at the moment, as you saw, I'm running it off the ISO image, right? I haven't installed it into a virtual machine. We had a few people who thought this was a great idea because, for example, if you're teaching a course in computational neuroscience, this makes it really easy, right? Because you don't have to bother telling your students that they need to go and install software A, B, C, and D. All you can say is, get this ISO, just run it in a virtual machine, and then they can do whatever exercises you want them to use. So as it tells you there, you can either try Fedora or you can install it. Let's try it for the time being. It's a standard operating system, right? The UI looks different because it's not a Mac or Windows, but it's got all the tools you need. So you've got your browser, you've got a terminal, you've got your file manager, for example, right? Similar to Macs and Windows, you've got different workspaces, so you can spread your work around. I'm going to open a terminal to show you how things work. Right. So for instance, on this operating system, we already have Jupyter Notebooks installed for you, so you can start. So all you've done is downloaded the image, and you now have Jupyter Notebook ready for you to use, right? So if I open my browser, right? So all you've done is download the operating system, but because we've pre-installed all of the software for you, you can just get started immediately, right? We include IPython for you, right? So I'll show you how, and now I've got Nest here, right? We packaged the latest version in this. I've got Neuron here. I've got all of NumPy and SciPy and Matplotlib. I've also got Brian. Right. So all of this is already pre-installed. And here is the good part, right? So let's say you want to use a tool that's not pre-installed. For example, you want to use GitHub and you want to use Git. It's not pre-installed. Because we've already included it for you in the Fedora repositories, you can get it installed with one command, right? So you don't really have to go to the Git website and download Git from there. all of this is included. So not only do you have access to all the neuroscience software we include here, you also have access to the thousands of tools that other Fedora community members have included in Fedora, right? So because this is a virtual, this is a new image, it's just going to download metadata for the first time. Subsequent runs don't take this much time. Oh, and I will note, even though I use the terminal, because I find it easier to show that I've got all of these Python modules loaded in there, you do have, right, so there it is. And as you'll notice here, when you try to install the tool, it will also install all the dependencies for it, right? So for example, if you want to use Neuron, you need to have a compiler installed. This will pull all of that in. You don't have to install tools individually, right? So I'm just going to let this do that. But you don't have to use a terminal. I do it because it's easier for me to demonstrate how things work. But you've got GUI apps which will let you do all of this, right? So you've got software which will show you a nice GUI list of all of these tools, and you can pick your tools from there and install them, right? So it's a bit like an Android Play Store. And as soon as it loads, it'll show you icons and show you screenshots for all of these tools, and you can use those, right? So this is the idea behind Comp NeuroFedora. It literally is a whole operating system with lots of neuroscience software pre-installed, right? This is the simplest use case because most people that do research would have a workstation where they carry out all their work. I'm going to turn this off now. Right, so because it's a live system, as soon as I power off, all my changes are, well, they're gone. Okay. And the way the infrastructure in the community is set up, once you've included a piece of software, it's no longer limited only to the ISO installer itself, right? All of this then also becomes available as Docker containers. We publish all of this on the Fedora registry, which you can find. If you go to neuro.fedoraproject.org, you'll find a page that explains all of this in detail. But a general use case, for example, would be that you would pull an image, so the Fedora base image from Docker, using Docker. You can run this interactively, right? You can use Docker run interactive, and you can get yourself a shell. And then all the tools that I showed you previously in my virtual machine, you can, again, install them in this Docker image and use this as you require, right? So even if you are quite used to your Mac or Windows, as long as you have some container infrastructure on there, like Docker or Podman, you can, again, use all of these tools that we provide. Again, this is another simple use case. This is when you're prototyping and you're running your analysis and still developing your pipeline. When you finally done this and you want to share your work, for example, perhaps in a publication, you can create container images, right? More and more scientists are now creating these images to share work with each other. And what this does is it gives you a snapshot of your work, right? So instead of telling somebody that they can go to GitHub and clone your repo and then build it and so on, you instead create either a Docker file or a Docker image for them, and then you can share the image. All they really have to do is pull your image, and then they can start working with it, right? There is no limitation to what you can include in container images. It can be source code, it can be data, it can be data files if you want, just Word documents if you prefer. But it's a really good way of making sure that the platform you used, the versions of software that you used, somebody can use the exact same versions and try and reproduce your results, right? Because depending, if somebody tries to reproduce your results on a different platform, it could just be a different version of Python or a different library. there's already a chance that they won't get the exact same results. So being able to share Docker containers becomes quite a useful tool here. And because we provide a base Fedora image and all of these tools, if you use this container and you share this container file, somebody else that creates a container image will get the exact same versions of software, right? So that makes it quite easy. So these are all user-focused cases, right? So you have your operating system. You don't have to use the Comp OS. You can use any of the 20 Fedora variants, but you'll still have access to all our tools. And for anybody who's a developer who develops software for neuroscience, there's quite an advantage of making your software available in such a well-integrated operating system, right? Because it's quite rare for one tool to do everything. Most people use multiple tools to implement the whole pipeline that they need to process. And what we can do is we can have all of these tools, the complete pipeline, pre-installed in this operating system, right? So people no longer have to go to your tool, to your GitHub page, and then figure out, oh, but I need tool Y now to do something else, right? They get all of that ready here. And while we do all of this, because Fedora is a software-focused community, you get the advantage of the whole knowledge base of the community, right? So when we include your software, it'll go through a peer review process, right, where we run some basic checks. For example, we check if the license is an open source license or not. There'll be common programming checks. For example, if the C program that you're using, does it build properly? What library version does it use? Are you following best practices or not? Is your versioning correct? We build everything from source code. So even though most people now will have continuous integration on Travis or GitHub Actions, where they test whether the software works, we will do it again. And we will do it in a clean operating system with fixed versions of libraries, right? So we can confirm that if it builds here, every user that uses it will get a correctly built copy, right? I think most people are quite happy with 64-bit systems, but as I said, there are specialist platforms. So your tools will also be available on all of these, right? So you don't have to provide ARM builds. We do it for you, right? So people can use them on Spinnaker and other platforms. An important aspect of our tool chain is we will run all your unit tests, right? I have asked quite a few users whether when they download tools from different places, they ever bother to run unit tests to check if these tools work correctly. The answer is generally no, right? Because users assume that stuff works correctly, but that may not be true. So we will verify that the unit tests run, which means the results people get from these builds are correct, right? We also proactively keep checking things against new versions. An example is Python 3, right? So even before Python 2 was discontinued, we had already started testing all the tools in our set against Python 3 to make sure they were supported, right? And we file lots of issues upstream with maintainers, with their developers. Where possible, if the issue is simple enough, we will also submit patches and help people improve their code and fix bugs, right? And of course, finally, before we release all of these tools to users, there is a whole quality assurance pipeline, right? So just because it's in Fedora doesn't mean a user gets to use it, right? We will test these out with multiple people. People give feedback and say, yes, this works correctly. We can set up test cases. So for example, we can give them example files to work with and see whether they get the expected result. Basically, because it's a software-focused community, it implements the complete software development pipeline, right? So what you get at the end, you can be very confident that it works correctly, right? I'll quickly give just an update on where we are now. We are currently 30 volunteers. Surprisingly, most of these are not neuroscientists. Most of these are just people who like to code and are interested in neuroscience, and they're interested to learn. So they just hang out with us, they help us. We have 200 tools in NeuroFedora already, but we have 200 more in inclusion in the list. I hadn't realized how many tools there are in neuroscience. It's only when we started filing issues to make our backlog that we realized that there are 500 to 600 tools in neuroscience that all do slightly different things. For the past 2 years, we focused on computational neuroscience. This is primarily because I come from a computational neuroscience, that is my domain, and therefore I was able to help people and prioritize tools and help them learn how these are meant to work. So as our end product of phase 1, we now have the Comp Neuro OS, right, and the container images and so on. Now that we've sort of addressed this domain, we would like to move to neuroimaging and data analysis. And the amount of software in computational neuroscience is very less compared to the amount of software that's used in experimental neuroscience, right? This is our issue tracker. Again, because we are an open source community, we use an open source tool, so we don't use GitHub, or we don't yet deploy GitLab, but we might. But we have our own open source Git interface called Pega. And as you can see that we have 215 open issues. A few of them are community-based issues. For instance, we are presenting a poster on NeuroFedora at the INCF assembly later this month. And I need to make the poster for that. But a majority of our tools are, a majority of our issues are tools that need to be included in Fedora, right? We also have a Google form. Again, the link is in our documentation, where you can suggest some software for inclusion if you want. What we really need in phase 2 actually is we need help from users and developers from these domains, right? Because one can build software and, well, test that it builds correctly, but you need users to actually use it and give you feedback and say, yes, this works as expected, there are no regressions, it's not crashing when I start it. So we're actively trying to engage people from neuroimaging and, well, experimental neuroscience. And we're trying to convince them to spend maybe an hour every 2 weeks to try and help us with working on these tools. It isn't easy because I think we all agree that, well, we are quite busy in science. There's so much to do all the time. There's so many deadlines that tend to crop up. But it's an hour or 2 every week. And we keep pushing people and we keep emailing them and say, well, you developed this tool and I think we think it's a good addition to NeuroFedora. Are you open to helping us out in trying to include this in Fedora? I'm pretty much at the end of my slides, but there are various ways you can help. The easiest is simply to use the platform, right? The more users we have, the more likely it is that developers will want their tools to be on the platform, right? It's kind of a catch-22. You can't get enough users because you don't have enough tools, but you can't get enough tools because you don't have enough users. And that cycle needs to break somewhere. So the starting point is just please use the platform. If you see something that doesn't look right, tell us so we can change it. If you look at our list and you find some tools that you use that we haven't included, please let us know. We always prioritize special requests because that means somebody's actually going to use the tool, right? As opposed to just including tools and not knowing whether people are using them. And of course, if you are computing minded or you would like to learn a little bit more about software development, you can actually help us to maintain more of the software, right? It isn't very complicated, really. It's if you have installed software on your system manually, it's pretty much the same process. It's just that there are certain tools to make certain checks at each step of the pipeline to make sure things are working correctly. And there are advantages. I tend to say this a lot to all the students I run into, because most of us realize when we're trying to do something, our first sort of reaction is, oh, well, I'll just do it myself. But there generally seems to be somebody else who's already solved the problem and has written a tool for it. So if you are going to use the platform, you become aware of all of these tools, right? Because you may not have used before. And we, on our documentation, we maintain a list of all of these tools with what their functions are. So you can go through the list and see, oh, well, does something already exist that could do something that I need to do today? Again, for students and especially for junior postdocs, nowadays software development is actually quite important in neuroscience. And by working with NeuroFedora, you get to actually practice these things, right? So you may not use Git on a daily basis in your research. But while you're helping us with Fedora, you will use Git quite a bit, and you'll get to learn how to branch things, how to open pull requests, how to do code reviews, that kind of thing. And finally, given that a lot of developers in neuroscience develop these tools in their free time, right? So they do a lot of science. Some people are lucky enough to be funded. They receive funding either from the university or from a grant, and they're able to buy out time to work on these tools. But a lot of people develop these tools because they needed to do something, they couldn't find a tool, and then they say, well, go on, then I'll share it with people, and people can go on. And so it's nice to be able to help them back. It's nice to be able to improve their software, contribute more features to their software. Yeah, so there are quite a few advantages of being involved in a community-based project like NeuroFedora. And on to my last slide. We want to make it easy for people to get in touch with us. All of these links are on our documentation, so you don't really need to take anything down. But if you go to neuro.fedoraproject.org, you'll find information on how to use the platform. You'll find information on what is included. You'll find information on what is in the queue. And of course, you'll find information on how you can help. But depending on what your preference is, you can use the mailing list if you are slightly old school like me and still like to have everything in the mailbox. But if you prefer chat, you can just come around anytime and speak to us. We host open meetings every 2 weeks. The next meeting is on Monday. It happens at the same time every 2 weeks. That's at 1400 UTC. And we will send out reminders to the mailing list, and we'll publish reminders on Twitter. So if you just want to hang out and see how things work, you can just come up to a meeting and introduce yourself. And if you have a special request, you can come up to a meeting and introduce yourself and just tell us what you'd like to have included. Yeah, and I think with that, that is us. That is NeuroFedora. Yeah, use it and let us know what you think.
Well, thank you a lot, Ankur. Thanks for that. As Ceci said, I think that this has a potential to solve most of our headaches. So thanks for sharing that with us. Before I move to any potential questions, I'd like to remind our audience that if they want to join us and discuss this topic further with our guests today, they can join us on the Zoom room, which is just shared right now. We're going to close this YouTube session just after, so if you want to continue talking with us, just join us straight. Do we have any questions from the chat?
I'll stop my screen share now so that people can join us. There we go.
I mean, it was a nice background. Yeah, I'd like to say that we try to find a time that is suitable for most people around the world, because we all connect at different times. Most people watch that podcast. We don't have a big audience at the moment, so yeah, I guess we won't have live question for this.
That's all right. Yeah, I think we've all been to enough online sessions now to know that most people will look at recordings later and get in touch. That's
after a year of pandemic, I guess people watch everything podcast and
yeah.
But if they have any question, we shared all the links you shared with us, so they can access everything. Your project, your contacts are on Open Neuroscience.
Thank you very much.
Also on the description.
Yeah.
And I guess we can just say to our audience, see you next week. We're going to have another talk about, this time we're going to talk about open source hardware. So we're going to change a little bit the topic. So
that would be great. That sounds really interesting.
So I hope to see a lot of people there.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, if you have any questions, just catch us on any of our communication channels and we'll be there to help.
Yeah, we shared all of that. Everything's in the description.
Thanks.
See you soon. And we're not live. Okay.